Charles Laughton's spiritual blood brother Orson Welles had a wonderful quote about the nature of film. He advised all young filmmakers that films should be made innocently, the way Adam and Eve named the animals. Now, I think that's a wonderful statement about the essence of film. I think it's a wonderful statement about the essence of Night of the Hunter. I think there is an achieved innocence about Night of the Hunter. I saw it for the first time innocently, as everybody does. I began to feel the childlike terrors before the gothic Robert Mitchum. He is the nightmare ogre, the Jungian father figure that comes after you in your dreams, you know, to punish you, to judge you, and all these things.
Just a man. Good night, Pearl. Sleep tight and don't let the bed bugs bite.
Laughton called it a nightmarish sort of Mother Goose story. And that's really the simplest reason why this film has such an impact on people who see it for the first time when they're young.
I saw The Night of the Hunter for the first time when I was about 10, and it terrified me because it was the worst nightmare for any kid. I think that's what's so frightening about The Night of the Hunter, is that it's so much from the kid's point of view, and you feel the isolation of the child.
Huckleberry steptoe.
Open that door, you spawn of the devil's own strumpet!
He sees through this man who is a killer, who's terrorizing a whole town, but nobody else, everyone else thinks he's wonderful. Everybody else thinks he's the charming friend, and this kid knows the truth and can't get through to anybody. His mother doesn't believe him. She says, you're lying. Even Uncle Bertie, the one man who does sense there's something wrong in the town and with the preacher, even Uncle Bertie, eventually when he does go to them, he's drunk and lets him down. This kid has no grown-up he can turn to. He's isolated in this world, and there's something primal about that, I think. And then the fact that he's so relentless, I couldn't get over the fact that he just appeared almost like a supernatural being in the distance. That scene where the young boy is looking out of the hayloft and thinks everything's fine, he's gotten away from him, and then he hears that song, leaning, and that prayer becomes this sound of terror, and he said, don't he never sleep? And as a kid, I remember distinctly the feeling of being chased and never being able to get away from somebody. You thought you were free, but he's still there. It's your worst nightmare, absolutely.
There was this TV at the bar in the Ed Sullivan Show, and Ed was introducing Charles Laughton, and it was going to be the Meshach, Ashach, and Abednego from the Book of Daniel. And Laughton was wonderful, and I thought, my God, I could book that man all over the country. And so I didn't eat. I paid my check and got a cab and flew over to the Mansfield Theater, where the telecast was coming from, and met him in the alley leaving the theater. And I approached him and I said, Mr. Laughton, I'd like to talk with you. He said, talk to my agent, old boy. And I told him, I need to talk to you. And and it truly happened, because, you know, Charles was very sort of huffy. And I said, you're throwing away $1 million, Mr. Laughton. And he says, what? So we went back to his hotel, and I truly left his hotel about 2 in the morning with a little contract written on the hotel stationery, and booked his first tour. And that's how it all began. Herman Wouk's agent was Harold Matson. And I told Harold that I was looking for a property for Laughton, because Laughton's health was beginning to intervene with the touring and all that sort of thing, because we didn't know at that time that he had had the beginning of cancer in the back. So Harold called me, and he said, I've got a script here that you might, some galleys here that you might like. And I said, well, fine, send them to me. And he did, and I read Night of the Hunter, and just like that, I knew that Laughton could do it. When Charles first read this thing and decided that we might proceed on this, he called me up one morning, at 1 o'clock in the morning. He said, oh boy, I've had a great idea. And I said, what, Charlie? He said, I'm going to play the preacher, because I nearly dropped the phone, because I knew I couldn't. I said, well, Charlie, we can never get a deal to make this picture with you playing the preacher. Oh, no, I'm not so sure about that, blah, blah, blah. And so we kicked that around for a couple of days. And one day I said to him, I said, well, you know who would be wonderful as the preacher, Charles, is Laurence Olivier. Oh, my God, he went into an absolute stampede of objection, and it would never work. He would never let me direct him with my directing him. Oh no, blah blah blah. I sent the thing to Olivier, and Olivier was crazy about it, and would have done it if we could have waited 2 years, but we couldn't wait 2 years, and Mitchum was doing something. He was set to do Not as a Stranger, I think it was, for Stanley Kramer, and so he wasn't really in the picture much. And then one day, I was talking with Laughton, and I were talking about it. We hadn't got a deal set yet, and Laughton said, "How would you think of what would you think of Mitchum?" I said, "Well, he's so obvious as an evil character that he'd probably play it very well." So Laughton sent him the script, and right away Mitchum was interested, and that was the setup for Night of the Hunter.
Night of the Hunter was Davis Grubb's first novel. Charles Laughton got in touch with Davis Grubb immediately after he decided he was going to do the film. And he got on the phone, called him up in Philadelphia, where Grubb was working in an ad agency. And Grubb said, I always remember what he said to me. He said, "My God, man, who are your masters?" And they were simpatico, these two. They both loved Thomas Wolfe and Faulkner, and then writers who were very expansive and lyrical. And they both had a visual sense. Davis Grubb had studied for a year at the Carnegie Institute of Technology as an art student. And when he was talking to Laughton about the film, Laughton actually went to Philadelphia to stay with Grubb for about 5 days, and they talked about what they were going to be doing. And when Laughton went back to L.A., they continued to have a correspondence and talk about the film. But when Laughton would ask Davis Grubb about the film, Grubb would draw pictures for him. So, well, here's what I had in mind. And he would draw some pictures of characters or settings. And when Laughton got back to L.A., he wrote a letter to Grubb saying, "The pictures are wonderful, send more drawings, I want more drawings." And these drawings Laughton used extensively in the film. Some of the drawings that Davis Grubb did are virtual storyboards for the film. James Agee was brought in as the screenwriter, and he's was a perfect choice, really, because he grew up in Eastern Tennessee, so he would understand very well the world of West Virginia and Crecept's Landing that Grubb wrote about in his novel. He was fascinated with coming-of-age stories, children, endangered children in trouble. The subject matter of the book was perfect for him. And he'd already written about the Depression. He'd written a wonderful volume, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. He and Walker Evans had lived with Alabama sharecroppers in the 30s, and he wrote about this family and the hardships of the Depression. So the Depression story that Davis Grubb wrote in The Night of the Hunter was appealing to Agee. So it was a perfect fit. He was so fond of the novel, and Laughton was so fond of the novel, and had worked so closely with Davis Grubb on it, that they both agreed the novelist should get first position on screen. If you notice, it says, a novel by Davis Grubb, screenplay by James Agee. So the novelist gets first credit, and Agee has a letter where he says, "I perfectly agree with Charles. Davis Grubb should get first credit, first position," because he said it's rare that a novelist furnishes such a movie story as Davis Grubb has done. I think that was his phrase, a movie story. Because the novel is very cinematic.
There was some talk of perhaps Davis Grubb adapting his novel, but United Artists wanted somebody more experienced and with some screen credits at the writer's chair. His most famous credit was probably The African Queen that he worked with John Huston on. So they contacted Agee, who was then living in New York, and signed him to do the script.
And he started writing in April of 1954, and he delivered on time at the end of June in 1954.
It was 293 pages. Of course, we know the standard thought is a page of script equals a minute of screen time.
So it needed an editor, and Laughton was the man to do that. Certainly, Agee could edit himself. This is another myth, that somehow Agee didn't know how to rewrite a script. He wrote a series for omnibus television in the 1950s called Mr. Lincoln, 5 episodes about the life of Lincoln. And you can see drafts in various archives where he has rewritten in just a few weeks, in some cases just a few days. And some of the scenes are extensively rewritten, whole new scenes, created, other things thrown out, things rearranged, so he could certainly revise. The idea that Agee was canned from the project, that he was fired, is wrong, because letters have come to light that show he was on the payroll for the entire revision period. And the final draft comes out of that first draft, clearly. For one thing, the shooting script retains the structure that Agee had. The book is in 5 parts, but Agee creates a 6-part structure, and it's clear in the script because he fades out her irises at the end of nearly every section, so it's quite evident. And that same structure is in the shooting script, not quite as evident because Laughton pushes the film forward and has some surprising cuts from the scene, so they're not as cleanly marked as they are in the script, but it's still the 6-part structure. Also, the scene where we learn that Ben Harper has hidden his stolen money in the daughter's doll, that scene comes about halfway through the book. It turns up in a dream that John is having. It's a flashback. Agee plucked that scene from the middle of the book, put it in the front of the movie, and we see Ben Harper hiding the money. We don't know where he's hiding it, but we know he's hidden the money, and we move forward from there. And that chronological structure is retained in the final script as well. The wonderful bit of the knife coming through Harry Powell's pocket in the burlesque house, that was Agee's bit. He had the hand that was marked hate going into Powell's pocket in the burlesque house, and the switchblade was supposed to flip up through his trouser leg, which only reinforced the sexual image there, of course. Green Office was probably not going to go along with that, so in the movie, the hand goes into the coat pocket, and the knife flips up through the coat pocket. But that wonderful image, which is another one of those unforgettable things in Night of the Hunter that everyone remembers, that was in James Agee's original draft. Not in the novel. He invented that himself. He also ended his script with the camera tilting up to the sky, and in the sky he wanted the faces of children to, as he put it, blossom in the night sky, and images of kids of all nationalities and races, sort of a mosaic of life. That was how he wanted to end the film. Very symbolic, very unrealistic way of ending it. But that image of kids in the sky ends up at the front of the film. It's not in the shooting script. Laughton at some point decided to go back to Agee's concept, apparently, and put it at the top of the film.
I'll explain that to you. And then the good Lord went on to say, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing.
When we made Night of the Hunter, I knew no one in Hollywood in the production end of things. I only knew of them. I knew, of course, that Stanley Cortez had worked with Orson Welles, and I heard wonderful things about him. And Laughton was very enthusiastic about him, and I arranged for them to get together. And I believe that it was through Stanley that Laughton got with Hilliard Brown.
Because there was less time pre-production to prepare for the film than there usually is, the preparation for this film was done every night over dinner after the shoot. So Laughton would take these gentlemen, plus Milt Carter, the assistant director, and perhaps Ruby Rosenberg, the production manager, and they would prepare the next day's shooting. Hilliard Brown would start sketching what the floor plan would be for the set. Stanley Cortez would discuss the angles he'd like to shoot it from. This would lead to more sketches, always a cooperation. Stanley Cortez saying, well, if you could give me a little more set over there, I could move the camera here for a great angle. And whatever he asked, Hilliard Brown would be happy to do, and vice versa. Sometimes, though, these sketches were executed on tablecloths. As Bob Golden put it, we ate a lot of food, we drank a lot of booze, but we got the job done. The film was made for well under $1 million. I've heard between 400 and 800,000, which even in those days was not a lot of money to make a movie. The cost of the novel was $75,000, $80,000. Probably the most expensive single item was Mr. Mitchum's salary. So they made the film very quickly because they had a very little budget. Principal photography was really only about 6 weeks. Laughton also, and this is very unusual, kept his editor on hand during the shooting instead of just bringing him in after the fact. And similarly, it's unusual, highly unusual, that he had his composer on the set during the shooting. Bob Golden, the editor, told me that in his view, the most important person on the production next to Laughton was the composer of the music score, Walter Schumann. Laughton and Gregory had worked with Schumann before on the stage. Schumann had written a beautiful a cappella chorus for John Brown's Body. They sometimes sang folk songs, and sometimes they were like a vocal orchestra, and sometimes they would be like a Greek chorus, speaking some of Stephen Vincent Benet's poetry. It's really a remarkable piece of work, which, because it was written for the stage, is practically unheard today, but it really set the stage for his work on The Night of the Hunter. To the disappointment of many, especially Mr. Mitchum, they did not go back to Davis Grubb country and shoot the film in West Virginia, except for background plates and certain cutaway shots done by the second unit director, Terry Sanders. The whole film was shot either at the Rowland V. Lee Ranch in Chatsworth or at the Culver Studios.
I got a call on the phone, and the voice said, "This is Charles Laughton," and I thought it was my brother or somebody putting me on, but it turned out it really was Charles Laughton. And he said he'd heard about a film that Dennis and I had made called A Time Out of War, and he'd love to see it. The reason he wanted to see it was that he had this film project that was going to start very soon, Night of the Hunter, and the river was a very important part of the story, and Time Out of War all takes place along a river one afternoon late in the Civil War. I had, besides co-producing with my brother A Time Out of War, I photographed it, and he was interested in the photography. He wanted me to go back east and actually find a river that worked with the Night of the Hunter story. We wound up where we should be, on the Ohio River, down near Moundsville, where the penitentiary is there. So I spent at least a week or two going over the script in detail, shot by shot, scene by scene, making little drawings of what we were talked about. And he, in turn, made some very simple drawings of what he had in mind, showing screen direction and that kind of thing. Laughton would do very simple drawings like these. This is the rabbit, if you can see that, and the kid's boat going by. Here's the spider. Laughton drew the spider web and the boat going by. So he was very specific, you know, if I could get things. Here's the helicopter shot of the house where which I drew, and where the body was discovered.
75, 80, 85, 90, 95, 100. Here I come, ready or not.
I was there about 3 weeks, and when I came back to L.A., I remember sitting in the big screening room with Charles, and we looked at every foot of film. I remember prior to that, he was in the same screening room studying Griffith films, and particularly studying Birth of a Nation. And also we ran a original print of Intolerance, which was mind-blowing. A nitrate print, which was incredibly beautiful and hand-tinted. It made me appreciate, you know, those early filmmakers. And I think that's what Charles was reaching for, the excitement of the early filmmakers, you know.
Laughton wanted to restore the power of silent films to talkies, and this was something that Agee was very simpatico with. As Laughton told Lillian Gish, I remember when I'd see the Griffith movies, everybody was leaning forward in their chair, anxious to see what's happening. I go to the movies now, and people are just sitting back, eating their popcorn. I want to grab them by the scruff of the neck and have them sitting forward again. Toward that end, he and Agee started screening classic silent movies, especially Griffith's, but also The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse and so on. And this became key to the whole creative process of the Night of the Hunter. In terms of the result, the final film, there is something singular in the way he directed the film. We know that most films are made in short takes with the slate at the beginning and the end. Laughton only did a slate at the beginning of each reel and let the camera run for the whole 10 minutes until they ran out of film. So Laughton, in effect, directed his movie the way directors of silent movies used to be able to direct their films while the camera was running. Aesthetically, there are so many echoes of silent film. You can see in a lot of Stanley Cortez's cinematography certain misty pastoral effects straight out of Griffith, The Way Down East, and Henry King's Tolerable David. Cortez, who had done the same thing for Orson Welles' Magnificent Ambersons, and only then brought back the iris effect that had been a common part of silent movie grammar at that key moment when the children are hiding in the cellar and Preacher is outside leaning against the tree. The chase sequence itself, always cutting back and forth from Preacher getting closer and closer and the kids struggling to get into the boat and to untie the boat. That back and forth cross-cutting is just classic Griffith montage. And of course, that was the moment where Laughton most wanted to have the power of silent movies.
Silent movies, much like Night of the Hunter, do isolate certain powerful moments by being silent or by being in black and white. You know, we've joked, you know, are they going to colorize Night of the Hunter? Please God, no, never. You know, because black and white is actually part of the fundamental production value and atmospheric projection of this film, as vital as the music. I mean, here's where Stanley Cortez's contribution is reinforced.
I could not see the picture done in color. You know, that at United Artists, it'll gross much more money if it was done in color. And I said, no, that's the one thing I think I didn't know enough about. I said, no, I think it's a black and white picture. And Laughton did too. Laughton was very happy that it wasn't to be in color. In fact, I don't think he would have done it if it had been in color.
Stanley Cortez, one of the great cinematographers, had experimented with what was then a new high-speed film called Tri-X. He'd experimented with it in a film just before Night of the Hunter called Black Tuesday. On Black Tuesday, by the way, Stanley Cortez was cinematographer, Hilliard Brown was art director, Bob Golden was the editor, and Peter Graves was one of the stars along with Edward G. Robinson. So this entire group were just moved over by United Artists from Black Tuesday to Night of the Hunter. So part of the reason this film worked so well was because of the camaraderie of these people, this group. And Cortez had experimented with Tri-X on Black Tuesday, and then he used Tri-X on Night of the Hunter because it gives a sharp contrast between the blacks and the whites. And the blacks, as he says, go black. So in the scene with the preacher on the horizon and John in the hayloft, the contrast between the light and the dark areas is strong. And it's part of the sharp-edged effect of that film is this stark contrast between the shadow and the light.
John knows. Is that it, Harry?
The film has clear links to what's known as German Expressionism. It was a form of film from the silent era on into the talkie era in Germany. And it was, you can see it, a good example is in Dr. Mabuse the Gambler by Fritz Lang, a very realistic nightclub, but the shadows are so threatening and so dark. So it's a fusion of realism and expressionism. Expressionism is an attempt to break down reality and get at some inner essence, some interior state of mind, you know. And the shadows in expressionist films create a sense of claustrophobia and threat. And in the seminal German expressionist film, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1919, the sets are painted. Everything is clearly artificial around the characters. And those painted sets, that look of artificiality that is very much a part of German expressionism, shows up in Night of the Hunter. In the river journey, for instance, when the children escape from the preacher, they go into this mythic, magical world under the stars, and they drift down the river. And they go by a barn and a farmhouse, and it looks like a painting. And Hilliard Brown says, it looks like a painting because we wanted it to be non-realistic. You know, we didn't want it to be a real farmhouse. This is the children's point of view. It's their world. The world looks different to them. Everything is strange. We see frogs in the foreground. We see rabbits in the foreground, and they are huge. You know, the children are distant in the background. Scale is off. He had very clear images of what he wanted, and he did some of those drawings. And he's quite clear what he's doing in some interviews. He said, this is a storybook world for the children. We're capturing their sense of the world having become a dream. So this dreamlike quality is captured in expressionistic images.
When he discussed this with his art director, Hilliard Brown, Brown immediately got the idea of the fact that little boys don't always pay attention to everything. They're just focused on what they're focused on. So when he built Cresap's Landing, Hilliard Brown might construct a picket fence that the boy might notice as he's walking along it, but there wouldn't be any house behind it. Later on in the town sequence, he would put up a lot of neon lights that didn't really have any connection to any particular store, saying Coca-Cola or something like that. This in turn led to a lot of the minimal sets that we see in the picture. The chapel-like set for the bedroom where Willa has her last night and Preacher sacrifices her in an almost ritualistic fashion. That was just a backdrop. There was no set besides the backdrop and the bed.
And that is a contrast to very realistic scenes that Laughton is creating in Rachel Cooper's farm, for instance, very pastoral scenes. And those are all influenced by D.W. Griffith. The influence of Griffith can't really be overstated for this film, it would seem. The film, part of the split in the film, is partly realistic, partly expressionistic. It's partly light, it's partly dark. And the acting in the film also splits into two camps. There's these exaggerated, broad characters like Robert Mitchum himself, who is playing this preacher in very broad strokes. Evelyn Varden, who plays Icy Spoon in a broad way, and Peter Graves, who's understated. There's Don Beddoe, who plays an understated part. James Gleason plays his role understated. And, of course, ultimately, Lillian Gish, very restrained, very understated, and she is the contrast to the extravagant, over-the-top Robert Mitchum. Simon Callow has some fascinating comments on it as Brechtian acting, which the writer Martin Estlund says, Brechtian acting is acting in quotation marks. And that is exactly what Mitchum is doing. I'm playing the part of this role, and Harry Powell is playing the part of it. And you can see the levels of playing and consciously looking at oneself as an actor. And that is very much what Laughton did. Callow talks about Laughton also as a Brechtian actor. And Brecht loved Charles Laughton's acting. And Bertolt Brecht and Charles Laughton worked together. Laughton helped him rework his play Galileo. So Brecht and Laughton were great friends, were very close, and Laughton's performances are very often performances that are sort of watching him perform. And that heightened quality that Charles Laughton brought to his parts just seemed to have been absorbed by Mitchum. Charles Laughton wanted Robert Mitchum for the role, partly because of his sexual persona. He felt that this would be an energy that would be great for the preacher and would add to the hypocritical nature of the man and help his charisma. Davis Grubb, the author, was a little worried about Mitchum as this sex symbol, and Laughton told him, if you're going to sell God, Davis, you have to be sexy. So he wanted Mitchum exactly for that quality of sexual power. There's a shot in the film of a train charging across the screen. Icy Spoon says to Willa, you need a man, and this train comes, and the preacher's theme comes in, dun, 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 dun. So that masculine libido is right there in that image of the train, and it's carried through in the masculine libido of this preacher who arrives. You understand why he would sweep Willa off her feet and why he would be able to convince her. And Icy Spoon also is clearly fascinated by this man. I mean, the film is very much, and the novel, very much about repressed sexuality, and what happens to these women in the town, especially that funnel their sexuality elsewhere. For Icy Spoon, she channels it into she thinks about canning when they're having sex, and she is a religious woman and organizes picnics, and Willa channels her frustrated sexuality into religion, hysterical evangelical religion. So the religious aspect and the sexual aspect, the fusion of the two, were very important to Laughton, and Mitchum is a big part of that.
Preacher was a coveted role, but so was Willa. Agnes Moorehead, who had worked with Laughton, dearly would have loved to have done the part. Grace Kelly was after the part. In terms of Mitchum's offbeat casting, it's interesting that at one point Paul Gregory wanted to cast a musical comedy queen, even though she was long past the musical heyday, Betty Grable. But ultimately, Laughton really, from the start, wanted Shelley Winters, who had been a student of his. He taught young actors about Shakespeare and the classics. at his home in Hollywood starting in the late 40s. These were people who were up-and-comers in the business. I think Shelley Winters had already done her breakout role with Ronald Colman in A Double Life when she started acting for Laughton. By this time, of course, she was a full-fledged star. She had done A Place in the Sun and other fine films. And so Laughton and Gregory both felt that she had that vulnerable quality that Willa required. And even though she was still a young blonde star, that she was enough of an actress that she wouldn't mind looking a little browbeaten, a little frowsy, and that she wouldn't be rushing off to have her hair and makeup touched up all the time, as Gregory put it. So they were very glad to get her, especially since she only signed to do the film about 2 weeks before shooting had to commence. Billy Chapin was an experienced child actor from a family of child actors. Laughton met Billy Chapin. He talked to him and got to know him. He had Billy Chapin come out to his house, had him swimming around the pool, chatted with him for a while, chatted over a meal, and by the end of the day, it was love at first sight, and Laughton knew that he had his Jonathan in Billy Chapin. Interestingly, this was Laughton's technique with all the adults that he cast as well. They were surprised to learn that Laughton didn't want them to do a reading, didn't even talk necessarily about the role very much. He wanted to get to know them as people. Sally Jane Bruce was only 4 or 5 years old, but already she had sung with an orchestra as a contest winner. I think she had a relative who was a big band singer, so she had a somewhat theatrical background too. Paul Gregory and Charles Laughton had a lot of discussions about who should play the farm woman. At one point, they were thinking of Louise Fazenda, who had been an early star of films, was then married to Hal Wallace. They thought of Jane Darwell, who had played Ma Jode in Grapes of Wrath. Laughton said that he felt that the role required somebody who was bird-like. Paul Gregory said, well, what about Lillian Gish? And Laughton said, oh, you'll never get her, old man. She was too much of a purist, and she hadn't made a film since Duel in the Sun, and it was generally felt that she was not very happy with the general state of the movie business in those days. But at the same time, of course, Laughton realized that if he could get her, he would have a flesh and blood and very aesthetic connection to Griffith and the silent era. So Laughton called her one day after he had been at the Museum of Modern Art with Agee looking at Griffith pictures. In fact, he'd been running the pictures for weeks, and Lillian Gish had heard about that, didn't know why Laughton was doing that. And then he called her and told her about The Night of the Hunter. And he said, I'd like to come over and talk to you about a role in the film. And she was very happy to accept.
Well, when we delivered it to United Artists, they had Not as a Stranger with Frank Sinatra and Bob Mitchum. And instead of releasing our picture as an important picture, they released the two together. Of course, they had much more money writing on it, a great deal more money. And that's the disappointing factor of dealing in this distribution company. Yeah, money is the bottom line. I wanted to sell the picture. We had 77 cities across this country that we played shows in that our names were known in, and I wanted to take the picture and roadshow it. And I felt that I could get the cost of the picture back in 77 cities, because the picture only cost a little under $600,000 to make, and I could get it started. But United Artists didn't want whoever had to say on this didn't want to do that. They I guess they thought it was too amateurville. But the picture got lost in distribution, and it didn't they just let us. They didn't know what they had. And the first thing they said to me, oh, it's an art film. And I didn't feel it was an art film at all. I thought it was I thought it was what really film promised to be. It carried you away. It took you out of your life and let you get involved with the magic of a storyteller.
It's clear from the ads that nobody knew how to promote this film, which is, again, that it is a film that doesn't fit any neat genre, and you can't call it a thriller, you can't call it a family drama, you can't, what do you call this thing exactly? The ads didn't stress the children in danger. Maybe they felt that would make it uncommercial, but you have no sense that it's a film about children being chased by a killer. This was an era in which religious films were being put on the screen, again, partly to compete with television. And they hark back to silent films. They were the Quo Vadis, Salome, the Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur were all remakes of silent films, but they were remade in the widescreen with color and lots of spectacle, lots of extras, and the spectacle was everything. And here is Laughton's film about religion, but dealing with it to show its hypocrisy, to show it as mingling with sex and perverted sex, and religion somehow perverted. It's dealing with it in a way that audiences were not going to be comfortable with. The archdiocese in Wyoming, the Catholic archdiocese in Wyoming, according to Paul Gregory, the producer, denied the film distribution. And Gregory wanted to sue them. He was going to go after, thinking this will be great controversy, be great publicity. For some reason, the United Artists wouldn't let him do that. So that plan got shot down. Yet another way the film might have been promoted. The Legion of Decency gave The Night of the Hunter a B designation because they said it degraded marriage. And the Protestant Motion Picture Council said it was flat out objectionable, and any religious person would find this film offensive. And it was actually banned in Memphis. The Night of the Hunter came into its own gradually. It took a while. It was first something of a cult film. A small group had latched onto it and saw it as this wonderful thing, and it was identified as a cult film.
It was only little by little over the years when the film would be seen on television, especially by young people who were seeing it for the first time, that the film started to be appreciated. It was always shown in museums. Revival houses started showing it more and more often, and eventually people took a second look at it.
In the 70s, as film criticism, film scholarship began to blossom, a lot of articles got written about The Night of the Hunter and brought it to the attention of an audience, and it began to play more and more on revival circuits in repertory houses. And in 1992, the Library of Congress put it on its National Film Registry. By that time, it was established as a classic. The minute it gets on the National Film Registry, it's noticed as a film of importance to American cinema.
Although it got mixed reviews, it's safe to say at the time. Some people really did catch on to what Laughton was after, and other people just had no conception of what was going on. It's been much more uniform over the years that now people who write about it critically in retrospect recognize it as a classic, which is what it is.